Good morning. I like that. My name is John Harris III. I'm a DC resident, founder of AuthenticReflection.org. I'm an entrepreneur, artist, organizer. We actually celebrated our 5-year anniversary yesterday on 4/20. But something that comes up when we're doing entrepreneurship workshops with youth, especially, and the first thing I say is you're a human being first, and you're a person second. And then that gets them to start thinking about the concept of running a business, being an entrepreneur, right? We define entrepreneurship as taking the risk to create your own freedom by creating solutions, right? Being compensated for that. And so when it comes to summits like this, when we're talking about wealth, we learned that a lot of wealth, especially in communities of color, disadvantaged communities, was dissipated by the matrix of the housing crisis, where people thought their housing was worth something that it wasn't when it was, and then it wasn't because of perspective. So I just wanted to know, how do you think that we could focus on defining wealth and creating that through entrepreneurship so that everyone knows exactly what they're striving for, so there isn't such a gray area on the definition of wealth and entrepreneurship?
Good question. Panelists, you want to begin?
Thank you for the question and the work that you're doing. Really
Yes.
appreciate it that you're on the ground doing that work. I'd say a couple of things. One is we need to really think about this as a state of emergency for investment within communities of color to start businesses. So if you're a business, if you have a business problem, you're in a company, you actually got to look at the size of the problem, and you got to actually adjust the supply chain so it actually meets the demand, right? I mean, that's how we operate business. But here we've got a problem. And the problem is that the amount of money that we're actually putting in to the network of folks that are actually doing this work is very small compared to what the problem is, meaning the backside of the problem of how we're going to be a competitive nation moving forward. And if, in fact, as you say, you're working with these young people and you're trying to get them to understand their relationship to capital and their relationship to ownership, then we really have to start with some big ideas. So one big idea would be, why wouldn't we make credit and access to financial services a utility, right? Why wouldn't we think about it as utility? So, we have utilities, so everybody gets electricity and water, right? That should be just as much, you should have access to the financial system in the same way. And that way, as an early age, as you get into the financial system and you have that as a part of just doing business in a society, you then have some sense of financial wherewithal as you move forward. Right now, we don't have that. The second big idea would be, why wouldn't we, if we're going to be doing CDFI work, and do people know what that is, community development financial institutions, they are, and Connie and I just had this conversation last night, if you looked at how much money we're investing in bringing access to capital to the table, it's not even a drop in the bucket to the problem. So the question is, why wouldn't we have a dedicated fund at the CDFI fund for people of color, right, so that we can actually invest? And then we need some big things to happen, right? We can't wait for this stuff to continue. And you know what? I got relatives and people in my community right now that have nothing. How many of y'all have that? How many of y'all know people like that? All right. So if, in fact, that is the case, then we actually have to do something really big. It has to be an economic revolution in this country. We need to actually, corporations and the government needs to serve us, and we don't need to just be sitting there getting sucked up as consumers. We need to be producers and owners of the means of production in this country.
Thank you. We're going to take one more question. I'm going to try to answer this question too, and then I'm going to get back to you. I'll get right to you. But I want to get back to the gentleman's question because I think it goes to the larger question that we need to have a discussion about, and that is about wealth ownership, period, in the African American and communities of color. Because we have been more people who consume and buy, and people to begin to understand that it's really, even when you own a business, you're owning a business, you own an asset. And you want to begin to think about your business not as a way of generating income, but what is the worth and value of that asset? And the same when it goes back to home ownership. And so we have to have this conversation in our own community because a lot of us really don't understand what it's all about. And for example, it's so important right now because we're trying to come back from the recession and the impact that the recession has had on communities of color. The real issue is that we did not have enough of the ownership assets. Only thing we had was our home. The people who have come back had other ownership. They owned businesses. They owned stocks and bonds. And therefore, they had more opportunities to come back. So one of the things, and we call this in our teaching, we call pond ownership. And I learned this from the Reverend T.D. Jakes when I had a chance to be with him a few years ago, when he talked about the parable of the hungry man and the fish. You all heard the parable. It said, if you give a hungry man a fish, you will feed him for a day. If you teach a hungry man how to fish, you will feed him for the lifetime. Well, I think the good Reverend took this to a whole new level when he said, if you show the hungry man how to buy the pond that is filled with fish, then he'll never worry about being hungry again, and neither will his children or his grandchildren or his great-great-grandchildren. My beloved, we have to talk about ownership and owning assets, appreciating assets, so that we can begin to close the wealth gap. Yes, you had a question over here, and then we had one more.
Good morning. My name is Nikita Rebelli, and I'm with the Center for Responsible Lending. I thank you all for your time this morning and for the insightful discussion. And I actually have a specific question for you, Michael. I'm going to kind of focus on you this morning. Since homeownership is so critical in terms of building equity, and many small businesses actually launch from a homeowner's ability to pull that equity and to get into a home, how do you reconcile policies that you were in charge of during your administration time with the Treasury with this conversation about increasing access to business? People of color really have been pushed outside of the marketplace in terms of home ownership, and we just haven't been able to get back in. And access to credit for people of color today is pretty much non-existent. So in many ways, many people of color have no ability to do some of the foundational things that so many Americans have done to start building wealth. Like nationally, we intentionally created homeownership policy to build a solid middle class. And if people of color are now locked out, what do we do if we're trying to make this bridge over to entrepreneurship?
Well, thank you for the question. I think it's completely and fully consistent with everything I've stood for my entire career. So I've been working on these issues now for 25 years, both at the University of Michigan in teaching and at the Treasury Department under the Clinton administration and under the Obama administration, fighting for fair lending, fighting for the new markets tax credit and the CDFI fund, building the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to protect consumers from abuses, fighting against the abuses in the subprime lending market, trying to open up access to capital for minority entrepreneurs and for homeowners. So for me, this is just in my lifeblood. I'm very invested in making sure this works. And I totally agree with you that minority homeowners got crushed in the financial crisis. I totally agree with you that minority homeowners are being left out of, in many senses, of the recovery. And I've done everything I can to try and change both those things.
We had another question. Yes, ma'am.
This is a little bit of a follow-up on my colleague's question over here. So again, I'm afraid it focuses a little bit on you, Professor Barr.
No problem.
I suspect as a carryover effort of the end of the Bush administration, the beginning of the Obama administration, a survey of small business finance, the SSBF survey of small business finance was canceled by the Treasury Department. It was ended. In fact, it was the only survey, that national survey that we had that allowed us to do essentially econometric studies showing that even if you controlled for credit worthiness, minority-owned firms were far disadvantaged to white-owned firms. We lost it. The last set of data came out in 2007. We haven't had it since then, so we couldn't see what happened during the crisis, which I think was devastating. As an entrepreneurial civil rights lawyer myself, Those surveys are critical for me in proving both the disadvantage of minority and women-owned businesses that allow us to maintain the federal programs to protect them, but also in showing the discrimination, explicit discrimination that happens by banks against minority-owned firms. So it's sort of a two-part question. Can we get that survey back? Are there things that this group can do to get that survey reinstated? Even if we have that gap, at least we'd restart it. But also, what do you all know about other data sets that are even close to as good? And I do understand that the intent was to have the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau pick up where Treasury left off on this, but they haven't done it yet. So we've now lost a survey, the last data of which was from, I think, 2004, 2005. We have nothing, and it's 2016, and we know during that period, if anything, discrimination was worse. So this goes back to what my colleague was talking about. We can't just keep saying credit matters. We have to prove, and those of us who are lawyers have to prove in court, that this discrimination is happening, and we need the tools to do it.
Yeah, again, I totally agree. I mean, I started working on data collection about minority-owned businesses in the 1990s. I had a series of work that we were able to get done at the Treasury Department in the 1990s. That died out in the Bush administration. There are legal barriers under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act to collection of good data on minority businesses. I tried in the 1990s unsuccessfully to get that barrier removed. Alan Greenspan, who was at the Fed, blocked it, even though the Treasury Secretary and the HUD Secretary and almost half of the Federal Reserve Board wanted to change that policy. Greenspan said no. And so we wrote into the Dodd-Frank Act, which I worked on, a provision that not only removed the legal impediment but required the data collection, gave that authority to the CFPB. The CFPB has not issued rules under it yet, but they recently announced that they're creating an office of small business data collection. They hired somebody to run it, and I think that's a good sign for the future.
Great. The other thing, as it relates to policy, we've heard credit come up a number of times, is basically my thoughts and some other people out there. From a policy perspective, America needs credit score reform. Credit score reform. The credit scoring system is not being used for what it was intentionally designed to be used for. It's used for a lot of other things. And it's turned out to be a way of discrimination in a number of ways. So we just need to look at the whole system and reform it so it can reflect America today. Well, let us all of our questions, all of our panelists to give us closing thoughts.
I just wanted to add one thing as well. At MBDA, we're also very focused on the data because as you well pointed out and the congressman said, and I'll say it again, I'm a recovering lawyer as well. But I understand from a policy perspective that in particular, the agency that I lead, it's the Minority Business Development Agency. So in order to overcome constitutional issues, I have to be very deliberate to make sure that that my agency continues to show through data that there continues to be disparities in the way that minority businesses are treated or the disparity in terms of performances. So data is critical. Data is critical because in order for us to exist and to be able to provide our services, we need to show that there is a reason why we have to be very targeted and very deliberate. So I have to underscore there's always a need for data. And the SBO data, the Survey of Business Owner data that the Census Bureau conducts, we have invested some funds to be able to even drill down even deeper in terms of the data because you can have a big picture, but unless you drill down, you don't have the richness of what's really happening. This issue about minority businesses is really playing out at the state level as well. So you have a role to play. When you ask the question whether this group has a role to play, absolutely you have a role to play. We have a role to play at the federal level, but this is an issue that is going to play out even more acutely at the state and local level, and organizations like this have a voice to raise. So I encourage you, and I think, as lawyers, you have a role to play that is very important.
Our other panelists can get a closing comment.
I would just emphasize that we really do need to have cross-sector collaborations, and we need to be more innovative. AEO was recently selected by the CDFI Fund for its National Innovation Challenge. And it's because we really are trying to make hard changes in the CDFI industry. We're trying to innovate. We're trying to bring data and cross-sector collaborations. And that's, I'm sure, part of why we were selected for this national challenge. But I want to encourage all of us to be much more innovative in thinking and bringing solutions to this. I, too, am tired of talking about the same issues for years and years and years. And I think it is enough out there now for us to, again, be able to cross-pollinate and leverage each other's strengths and assets to create real and new solutions. I invite all of you and any of you to join with AEO to end this innovation and some of the things that we're doing to bring new sets of solutions to bear on this issue. It's a pleasure, and I look forward to talking to you today and tomorrow of this event.
Gary?
So I've been working with the Haas Institute out of Berkeley and a number of other people to actually have conversations around the country about what is the new narrative for economic opportunity for the Black community. And so we've actually sat with Black people in cities around the country from different strata and had this conversation. And one of the things that continues to come up is that the fact that as African American people, if we actually can't participate fully in the economic largesse of this great nation, then this great nation won't continue on its upward journey in terms of economic opportunity in the world. The fact of the matter is not only is the situation for Blacks in trouble, but whites also are losing the middle class. So how do you create a Black middle class or more Black middle class if the white middle class is going down? So these issues are intertwined together, and if we're going to get to a new place with entrepreneurship, we really have to then start to begin to think about what are some of the big things that need to happen in this country, because it's not going to be a program, right? It's not going to be just another program that we create. It really has to be something that we are creating together as Americans to actually position ourselves economically. And the one way that all the data points to, if we're going to close the wealth gap, is that entrepreneurship is one of the keys for getting us there. So what I would say is that right now, as we all sit here, we have to start thinking about what is the new story that we're going to tell. Because if we keep telling the old story, we're going to keep getting the same results we've been getting.
Hey, Michael, last thought?
Just one quick remark, which is today, this year is the 25th anniversary of AEO. Connie didn't mention that, but 25 years of serving micro business in the United States. So I hope you won't mind if we could all just thank Connie for her work.
Thank you very much.
I'll just say that as somebody who has lived in Washington for 24 years, we need you. At times, for those of us who are in the Beltway, we have very stale ideas. You live the real, you are on the ground. You need to raise your voice and bring these ideas to DC more often. And really understand that the interplay between policy programs and budgets is a real one. And the government is, it's different. But you, I know I'm trying to be diplomatic here. But government is
By which you mean awesome.
But we're all government. You know, if it's broken, it's because we have exited. So we need to come back into the arena, and we need to make it work. I'm a public servant, and I believe in government. But it's the interplay of all of us. And I'm hopeful. I'm an optimist. I really think that unless we all engage in this effort, you know, we're not going to see the best of America. And I really believe that the best of America is ahead of us because our diversity is our strength. No country on this planet has the beauty of this great nation. So thank you for the opportunity to share with this panel and on this conference.
Great. We're going to wrap it up. Just real quickly, we did not get a chance to talk about some of the older existing businesses we still have to help them as well. And something that we should keep in mind is just not new businesses. Also, older Americans of all colors who are out of work and whose industry have gone. Entrepreneurship represents a great opportunity for them. I think you also mentioned people over 55, people who are retiring, but down there starting their own businesses. I think that's an opportunity for us. But most importantly, we're so glad to be here today. We forgot also to make this connection. I'm the only financial planner on the stage, but I think it's important, is you own a business because it go back to the gentleman's question, and building wealth. And there's a great book called The Millionaire Next Door, and then we have Dennis Kimbro's great book, Think and Grow Rich. But when you look at studies of how entrepreneurs become financially successful, they may only actually have a profit about $100,000 a year, but they save 20 to 30% of that. And so we have to talk about, see, we think that just because we get people in the business that they're going to understand how to grow their wealth. They still need financial management, financial education, so they can get the connection and see how over time they can build their wealth. And then lastly, to me, it's all about hope. This has been a very hopeful discussion. It's a very hopeful conference. And we give our panel a round of applause for having a very hopeful discussion.